Namaskar friends. Today I am going to speak about a very interesting topic which relates to the nature of India both as a nation and as a republic. They are not quite the same thing. On one hand, we are a free country since 1947. We then became a republic as of 1950. But of course, we are a very ancient nation. And while all of these are there together in one place in our daily lives, they have somewhat different connotations when you dig into them. And I am going to speak a little bit about what each one of these elements really mean, because it's in their interaction that our political and social life plays itself out. So if you open the Indian Constitution, you will see that it starts by saying India, that is Bharat. Now, some people may get the impression that India and Bharat are interchangeable. Now, if that was the case, then the English version of the Constitution would just use India, and then the Hindi version would just start with Bharat, and that would be the end of it. That is not quite how the framers of the Constitution put it, did they? Why did they use both the words together? Because they were very, very conscious that they were establishing a new country, a new republic, but they were also simultaneously conscious that it was a new reflection of a very ancient ethos and very ancient civilization that they were. And so they used both the words so that it could be reflected. So what I am now going to do is to give you a sense of how this has evolved with time. But let me right in the beginning put aside some doubts that you may already have, because unfortunately there are certain colonial era narratives that have continued to be perpetuated into even into modern times, that India was never a nation, that we had never had a sense of nationhood until the British came and essentially put us all together. Now, that was a colonial era narrative for obvious political reasons, because the British wanted essentially for us to think of ourselves as separate groups of people that who they could rule over. So it's not very surprising that somebody like, for example, Winston Churchill made the statement that there is no more a united India than there is a united equator. So that was a way of thinking that those who ruled us wanted us to think. But right in the beginning, if you remember, when Jawaharlal Nehru got up at midnight and made a very famous speech at independence, what does he say? He says, the soul of a nation long suppressed. Well, it could only have a soul that had been long suppressed if it already pre-existed 1947. So clearly there was a consciousness of a civilizational nation for a very, very long time. And that goes back right to the very beginning of the oldest text that we have, which is the Rig Veda. And you need to understand the Rig Veda in order to understand what India really is, because that is where the term Bharata comes from. So if you went back to the early Bronze Age, there was a relatively small tribe in and around what is now Haryana, and that tribe called itself the Bharatas, or the Bharata Trutsu tribe. They had a small kingdom on the banks of the Saraswati river, which has since then dried up, and it was challenged by a coalition of 10 tribes coming in from the west, probably from western Punjab and maybe Afghanistan and so on. And these 10 tribes were bearing down on this tribe of Bharatas in Haryana. Their leader Sudas and his guru Vasishtha took on the challenge, and they marched westward, and there was a big battle on the banks of the Ravi, in which the Bharata tribe completely defeated this coalition of 10 tribes. This is known as the Battle of 10 Kings. It is clearly described in the Rig Veda, which, as you know, is at least 4,000, maybe 5,000 years old. Now, after that battle, the Bharatas turned eastward, and then they defeated a bunch of tribes on the Yamuna, led by a chieftain called Bheda. Now, in doing so, they created the first large empire that India ever had. But having created this empire, they did something very unique. Now, what would have been common in ancient world was that if one tribe defeated another tribe, they imposed their own gods on the other tribes. Now, this is not what the Bharatas did. What the Bharatas did is they invited all the rishis and thinkers of all the defeated gods, and then they compiled all the knowledge of that time into a document that we have now received at the Vedas, but particularly the Rig Veda itself. And what is interesting is that in the Rig Veda, they basically clearly state this bringing together of these different ideas. So, the Bharatas did something really unique in that in doing this, they set in motion a process of assimilation, which is clearly described, by the way, in the last stanza or in the last hymn of the Rig Veda, where it talks about come together, sit together around the sacrificial fire, where all the ancient gods have a place. So, this is very important, because what they are doing is they are creating a system of assimilation which then begins to set in motion the creation of Indian civilization. And Indian civilization then begins spreading through this idea that you could keep adding new ideas along the way. And this idea was such a powerful one that thousands of years later, I'm a Bengali, I clearly don't come from Haryana, but I consider myself a Bharata. Why do I consider myself a Bharata? Because my ancestors at some point in time signed up to this idea of civilization through assimilation, through this accretive process. And so, this is a sense of civilization that then clearly spread through enough by the Pauranic period, which is by the late Iron Age, where the Vishnu Puran clearly describes that there, north of the deep oceans but south of the snowy mountains, live the descendants of the Bharatas. So, this is clearly by this period a sense that the entire subcontinent had of sharing a common civilization. And that is essentially what has continued through the ages at various points in time to the modern era. Now, this is why today you can be from Maharashtra, you can be from Kerala, you can be from Assam, none of them coming from this ancient, literal direct descendants of the Bharatas, but essentially what are we saying? We have signed up to this idea of civilization. That is basically what the idea of Bharata is. When we say India, that is Bharat, that is that ancient essence of civilization that has carried on and remains to this day. However, we also in 1950 signed up to creating a modern republic, and that modern republic is described clearly in the preamble what its nature is. When it was originally set up, it had a very liberal basis, and so we started out as a sovereign democratic republic. That was there in the preamble. The framers of the constitution at that time, led of course by Dr. Ambedkar, were very clear that they did not want to be very prescriptive about exactly how this new republic would play itself out. They were very conscious that they were setting the rules up that would have to apply over very long periods of time. So, they did not want to clearly state that this is what say for example, the economic arrangements of that state will be. So, they consciously left out words like socialist from the constitution, because socialism has a particular connotation about how economic and political arrangements will be set up, and they did not want that. Unfortunately, despite these very open-minded liberal intentions, just within a few months of the constitution being accepted, the very first amendment was done, and it fundamentally, right in the beginning, changed the nature of the constitution, in that it imposed several limits, for example, on ownership of, on private ownership, on freedom of speech, and so on. Now, one can debate whether reasonable limits are not needed on freedom of speech and private property ownership and so on. And indeed, the original constitution already had certain provisions, but by opening a can of worms, it set in motion a sequence of events which meant that this originally liberal constitution became increasingly illiberal, and it played into the hands of creating an increasingly top-down socialist state, which would be more and more overbearing. So, this first constitution really sets in motion the sequence of events that leads to more and more nationalization of banks and financial institutions, of airlines, and all these kinds of things, and therefore leads down a particular path that ultimately culminates in 1976, where the preamble itself being changed, so that we then went from being a sovereign democratic republic to becoming a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic. Now, that is a far more prescriptive view of what India's political and economic arrangement was. And what is equally important to recognize is that it happened in 1976 and was passed by a parliament under conditions of an emergency, and so there can also be a separate debate there about the extent to which it was constitutional in the first place. But having now framed it in this particular way, there was a problem, because the sequence of events that had already been triggered by the First Amendment, and then subsequently by the entire approach of economic planning, of essentially a nanny state where there was a planning commission that sat, and the wise men in the planning commission essentially were expected to tell everybody how to live their lives. That entire approach, sadly, even by 1976, was clearly failing. By that point, it was quite obvious that there were other countries, I mean, not just the war-ravaged countries like Japan and Germany, which had come back, but even countries like Korea or Singapore were clearly doing much, much better than India, and that India's economic performance was clearly faltering. The response to that was quite interesting from our intellectual class. Rather than begin to question this sort of path that we had taken, we actually went into the path of actually trying to justify our failures. So, for example, when our economic this socialist planning based approach clearly showed that it had failed by the late 70s, one of the establishment economists of that time dubbed it as the Hindu rate of growth. That's very important to note the turn of phrase. He didn't call it the Nehruvian rate of growth. He didn't call it the socialist rate of growth. He called it the Hindu rate of growth. So, what was he trying to say? Basically, what he was trying to say is that it is India and Indic civilization that had failed Nehru, and not the other way around. So, this is a very important thing. Whenever you hear this term Hindu rate of growth, remember that it is a deliberate relabeling of the failures of economic planning of the first 3-4 decades of after independence. And because we did not go back and revisit the sort of trajectory that we had taken, this whole approach was perpetuated for at least another decade, till in 1991 finally the system just broke down. It broke down at multiple levels. At a global level, of course, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc dissolved, and so therefore India lost many of its geopolitical and economic allies. But back here in India itself, by 1990-91, we had a major economic crisis. It appeared that we were going to default, and in that crisis situation, India was forced to carry out liberalization. Now, this was a major event, which, by the way, I as a university student witnessed. Again, remember, this did not happen because of a change in mindset. When Dr. Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Narasimha Rao stepped forward to begin to reform and open up the economy, it is not the case that they made an intellectual case. Far from it. Both them and the government of that time were very apologetic about the reforms they were doing. They were done almost as if they were betraying 40 years at that point of relatively successful policy making, which was totally not the case. It was more than obvious that that economic model had failed. But because the intellectual class continued to remain committed to this failed Nehruvian approach, there was no real rethinking. Instead, reforms were done out of desperation. Now, why is this important? It's important because of what happened subsequently. So once the initial economic crisis petered out and the economy began to recover, the reforms again slowed down, because, as I said, nobody had actually intellectually bought into it. And it's only again with Prime Minister Vajpayee who again went through another round of reforms. But and then again after 2004, it again petered out. Why is this stop and start happening? The stop and start is happening because at the core of all of this is the continued loyalty of the intellectual class to this older idea of a socialist republic. So this idea has, however, continued to be there, and although of course there have been constitutional attempts to and challenges to it, this remains embedded in many ways in the way we function. It remains embedded the way our bureaucracy functions, it remains embedded in many of our laws, and so this has continued to be the way we approach things. Now, slowly and steadily, however, it is beginning to change. I think one of the interesting things that is happening is that we are beginning to now question many of the assumptions that are embedded in this approach of being a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. First of all is finally people are speaking out and saying, how was that 1976 amendment, the 42nd Amendment, itself democratic when it was done under conditions of an emergency? Is it even constitutional? Then there is a questioning, of course, of the fundamental basis of many of these ideas that had been triggered by the First Amendment. So, for the very first time, we now have a government which speaks unapologetically about privatization. All these years, we used to use this euphemism, disinvestment, as if privatization was some sort of a dirty word. It's not the case anymore. Now, this doesn't mean that the public sector does not have a role. It does have a role, and there are parts of the economy, strategic areas of various kinds, some of it in the banking sector, some of it in defense, aerospace, etc., where clearly the public sector has a role. But on the other hand, we are also very clear that there are non-strategic areas where the private sector should really take the lead. And so for the first time, you will see that the government is very clear about the fact that we do want to privatize in the fullest sense of the word. This is also true when we use the word secular. Secularism for a very long time was used in a peculiar way, which essentially meant that certain kinds of rules and regulations and state intervention was acceptable for the majority Hindu community, but not for the others. Now, one could argue that that is not secularism at all. So, again, there is now finally a definite debate, for example, on whether the state should have control over Hindu temples. There is equally similarly I think, a healthy debate about the personal laws of religions other than Hinduism. And for example, there was the whole reforms being done, for example, on triple talaq and so on. So I think this is again another big area where a big debate needs to happen. Similarly, we are having, I think, after a long time, beginning to rethink what do we mean by the very nature of democracy and being a republic, in the sense that we saw a very major change with the changes with the removal of Article 370 in Kashmir, which had a special status. So why should a citizen of India in one part of the country have different rights than in another part of the country? So these are the kinds of changes that are happening. The point I'm making to you is that the civilizational idea of India, the civilizational nationhood of India, is very, very old. We are not even unique in this. There are other countries which have a civilizational view of themselves as well, incidentally, say China or Japan, Israel, which is a completely modern construct but has a sense of civilizational continuity. But there are others, Iran, for example. One could even argue that the European Union has a certain sense of civilization. Britain probably, one could explain Brexit in that terms as well. So it's not like we are unique in having a sense of civilizational nationhood, but even the Republic of India is not something that is static. It may have been triggered by a particular document, the Constitution in 1950, but that document itself is an evolving document. Our borders are also evolving. It's not that the borders that we had in 1947 are the same ones we have now. We have incorporated new territories along the way. For example, in 1975, Sikkim became a state. It was earlier a protectorate, and so on. So this is also an evolving debate. So both the civilizational nationhood and and what we today consider that and in its modern avatar, or the republic, the democratic republic, both of these are co-evolving entities, and they exist in many ways. For example, the Republic of India incorporates within it various elements which may not go back to the very beginning of the Rig Veda, influences that came at later times. In the same way, the civilization of India may not always coincide exactly with the Republic of India. For example, Nepal shares our civilization. There are many, Indonesia shares many elements of our civilization, but they are not part of Republic of India. So there are many, bits that keep moving. They are not neatly boxed in, but the fact that they cannot be neatly boxed into a clear definition does not mean that these two things do not exist and co-evolve. So the purpose of this talk is to give you a sense of what both the republic and the civilizational nation are, how they co-evolve, interact, and hopefully that this discussion future generations will also be able to take forward and evolve it according to the needs of their times. Thank you very much.
भारत हमको जान से प्यारा है, सबसे